Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 82 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Calgary Flames, in which the Sharks have lost 5-1. And in my previous review, the 9-2 loss to the Edmonton Oilers, I mentioned how the Sharks would have an opportunity to end this season on a bit more of a high note with their game here tonight against the Calgary Flames, a slightly easier opponent and an opportunity for the Sharks to carry a slightly happier vibe heading into the offseason after a season that has been mostly filled with despair and sadness. But unfortunately, I forgot about what team I was talking about. I forgot that I was talking about the 23-24 San Jose Sharks. Would it have really been apt for this team to finish this year on a victory? Probably not. Instead, what would and probably should have been expected is that the Sharks would lose exactly how most of these other games have gone this year. A 5-1 lopsided loss that saw the Sharks put up about 17 shots on net, not even managing to hit the 20 mark, and only barely managing to avoid getting shut out within the last few seconds of this game. That is the proper bookend to one of the worst seasons this franchise has seen in a pretty long time. But let us jump into this game, starting off in the first period where it actually seemed okay for San Jose. They started this game off decently well. For the first few minutes, there actually wasn't a whistle here tonight. In fact, there weren't too many whistles throughout the entire game, a pretty fast one, all things considered. And the Sharks hanging around with the Calgary Flames, doing some playing some okay hockey, getting a couple of good chances for themselves, or at least a couple of decent chances, but none managing to beat the Flames goaltender. And eventually, it would be Klapka getting his first career goal, something that the Sharks have kind of gone back to a bit over these past couple of weeks, giving up multiple first career goals to multiple different players. And then Blake Coleman would even manage to add one to make it 2-0 Calgary at the end of the first period. And this is where we really saw the San Jose Sharks show that they didn't really have much to play for themselves. The Calgary Flames, they're not a playoff team. They're not heading into the postseason. They're not trying to end off the regular season well so that they can carry some momentum into the actual part of the year that matters. They also will be heading to the golf courses after today, and yet they showed up. They were ready to play. They had some reason to be going, with this first career goal, with this 30th goal of the season. The San Jose Sharks, they also had some milestones to be able to hit. For instance, the Mikael Granlund to be able to hit his 60th point, which he would eventually end up doing on that final goal. And yet the Sharks, it didn't feel as though they had much to play for. And coming into the second period, they made that oh so very clear, because they basically didn't show up. The Calgary Flames were able to just run around the ice unopposed, and then added goal number 3, 4, and 5 to make it a 5-0 lead for Calgary at the end of the second period. In the third, really not much change. The Sharks maybe got like one decent chance on net, and that's about it. They would eventually get a power play and avoid complete embarrassment with a Zetterlund goal to make it a 5-1 loss instead of yet another shutout this season. But that doesn't really make anybody feel any better, and the Sharks instead just end off this season with a disappointing loss of a disappointing year. Moving on to the players to talk about, I was thinking I might not actually mention any players, but after the previous one, the 9-2 loss, I didn't want to end off this season with a scuffed game review, so to speak. So let us indeed talk about some of the players, because there were a couple of players who looked okay enough. Start off with the top line of Zetterlund, Granlund, and Eklund. A hit-or-miss game for these three players. From a defensive standpoint, there were definitely a lot of issues with them. In particular, both Eklund and Zetterlund, I thought, had a bit of a rough game on the defensive side of things. Granlund was a bit better, but not really by all that much. But at the very least, offensively, they once again took back the mantle of being the leaders on this Sharks forward group by playing clearly the best line on the ice for San Jose, generated a few chances for themselves, primarily the majority of the chances that the Sharks had in this entire game, even if there weren't that many. Just some good rush plays. They probably could have had a couple of goals with a bit better aim on some of their shots. Zetterlund in particular, while he would score the power play goal later on, he had like a post, I believe, one really, really close call. Granlund amongst them, setting up some really, really solid chances. So generally, I thought the first line did some okay things, but when you're not playing particularly well defensively and you're not able to nail those chances that you do get, it ends up being somewhat of a net negative for yourselves. Moving on to the second line, we have Kostin, Cunnin and Graf, playing Graf here in his final game of this regular season after having been signed out of college a couple of weeks ago. And I'd say he ended at the very least this season on a bit more of a high note. His last 2 or 3 games were somewhat disappointing, where he kind of faded off into the background and didn't really make much of an impact. Here tonight, I thought he was decent enough. A couple of good shifts. In particular, there was one right at the beginning of the second period where he made a couple of really, really nice plays to keep the puck alive, and that eventually led to a couple of Bordelot chances for that line, which was quite nice to see. Otherwise, Graf at the very least wasn't hemmed in heavily into his own zone. An okay enough game for a bit of brief stint with the San Jose Sharks that was decent-ish. We'll see how he returns next year into training camp, if he'll actually be able to earn a spot on the Sharks main roster, because that is far from being locked down. When it comes to the 2 other players on this line, they were mostly invisible, barely really noticed either Cunnin or Kostin actually here tonight, and so that's kind of that. It should be noted, actually, that there was a lineup swap, as Bordelot did jump up to the second line because he, from the third line, was having a very good game. In fact, I'd probably go so far as to say he was the Sharks' best forward of the night from a consistent standpoint. He didn't have the high highs of some of the Zetterlands, Eklunds, or Granlunds on the top line, but he definitely did not have any of the low lows. Some good hard work, even in a game that was so lopsided. One of the things that many people were somewhat critical of when it came to Thomas Bordelot in his previous stints with the team last year, the year before that, where he didn't necessarily seem to have that competitive drive to really push himself to get better. But in a 5-0 game at the end of a season where you're pretty much just going to go home after this one and not play another game or another meaningful game for another 6 months, the fact that he was still skating and still playing hard was a very good indication of the type of player he wants to be. And unlike Colin Graf, who I said his place is very far from being locked down for next year's roster, Bordelot, unless he has a terrible training camp, I feel as though his name should be penciled in. He's been really impressive these last few weeks of this season. When it comes to the other 2 players on this line, we have Nico Sturm, who I thought played rather well, not outstanding or anything, overshadowed a bit by Bordelot, his line mate, but still pretty decent. And then when it came to Danil Gushchin, kind of a bit like Colin Graf, where I will say Gushchin did have like 1 good shift where he made a couple of good plays, but unlike Graf, he was hemmed into the defensive zone a lot, and he didn't necessarily look super at home there. Not a ton of mistakes, which is a good thing. I don't think you could necessarily pick him out of a pile and say, well, he had a terrible defensive game compared to a lot of the other Sharks players who were looking very bad in their own zone as well, but he also wasn't really a positive force in that area either. And then we get to the 4th line of Carpenter with Studnicka and Smith. There were a couple of okay plays from these players. Smith had 1 decent look. Studnicka actually had a pretty okay play in the neutral zone to pick off a pass and then get a very good chance for himself. Besides those 2 looks, the 4th line didn't really make much of an impact, and that's kind of that. And then we get defensively for the Sharks. This has been the number 1 major issue throughout the entirety of this season. Yes, scoring has been a big problem for them as well. We do not want to discount that at all. But defensively, I mean, realistically, you take a look at this lineup. Do the Sharks have a single defenseman outside of maybe Mario Ferraro who would be on anything better than a 3rd pairing, if that, on practically any other NHL team? Probably not. And that's exactly the type of performance that the Sharks got throughout pretty much all of the 82 games that they have played. So starting off with the top line or the top pairing of Ferraro and Burrows, there were definitely some disappointing moments, to say the least, out of these 2 players here tonight. The same would absolutely go for the second pairing of Thrun and Addison. Thrun is just extremely hit or miss throughout the last couple of months of this regular season, so it's going to be very interesting to see how he ends up shaping up for next season. It is likely that he'll have a spot locked down just because the Sharks will probably have a lack of better options in that particular area, but hopefully he can show up maybe a bit stronger and more consistent in his level of play, because it's been so weird to watch Thrun go from up here to down here to up here to down here, game after game after game, where you literally never know the type of performance that you're going to get from him. The one thing that I will mention about one of the defensemen here on the third pairing, Jack Thompson, coming up, he had a rough game the previous night, or the previous game against the Edmonton Oilers, but generally so did the rest of the defense, so there was no real reason to actually single him out. Got a bit embarrassed by McDavid right at the start of the game, but he's not the first nor the last player to have something like that happen to him. Here tonight against Calgary, through the first few minutes of this game, I felt as though that there were still some Edmonton jitters. He was still somewhat affected by how that game went and had a couple of bad shifts to start off, but as the game actually went on, he got better and better and ended up being rather solid for the team as the game went on, like I said. So it'll definitely also be quite interesting to see where he ends up landing next year. He only played a couple of games for the San Jose Sharks after being acquired from the Tampa Bay Lightning in that Anthony Duclair trade, so there's not a ton of time on ice to really evaluate his game from, but I thought these last couple of periods tonight for Jack Thompson were solid enough to keep an eye on him heading into next year. And then finally we have the goaltender Devin Cooley. It was certainly a very unfortunate set of games for Devin Cooley here on this road trip through Alberta with the injury to Mackenzie Blackwood. He's forced to play both of these games and end up getting shelled in both of them. He let in 8 goals the previous game against the Edmonton Oilers. Here tonight he lets in 4, or he may have let in all 5 actually. I don't think Romanov let in a single goal. So rough night for Cooley. A couple of these shots definitely really difficult through traffic. You know, I look at the Klapko one, that was like a seeing eye bullet. There was also a tip as well, a couple of tips in fact that were difficult ones, but then 5 goals through 2 periods, especially when you consider like how he was performing against the Seattle Kraken last week, it wasn't necessarily the best outing and probably not the way he wanted to end his season off. But that would do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action in October, or I guess perhaps September if you count the preseason involved in that, so it will be yet another long off season for this franchise. We shall see what happens at the draft lottery that's coming up in a couple of weeks. We will see what happens in the entry draft about a month and a half later after that. Then the free agency will happen and all of those things. There are many question marks for this organization, but it'll definitely be a very interesting offseason, and hopefully at the very least the Sharks can come back a bit better next year. Class dismissed.